Hi, everyone. Welcome to our membership meeting where we have our guest speaker, Simon Schuster, who is the Executive Director of Michigan Campaign Finance Network. Michigan Campaign Finance Network is a nonpartisan watchdog group that has been following the money in all of our elections for a number of years, and we've had a number of people from that organization speak to our league in the past, and it always proves to be fascinating to find out who's spending the money, where it's coming from, and what is dark money. That is money that is not traceable. And our Simon Schuster, I'm sure, is an expert on all of these topics. So without further ado, I'm going to let him take over this meeting. If I could ask you all to mute yourselves unless you are speaking, I will be watching the chat box for questions. So Simon, you don't have to do that. And we'll open those questions up at the end of his presentation. So Simon, if you want to take it away, you're on mute. So if you could unmute yourself and have at it. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, hello everybody. Thank you for attending today. My name is Simon Schuster, and I'm, as she said, the Executive Director of Michigan Campaign Finance Network. Organization's about 20 years old, and certainly in an election year such as this one, we have our hands more than full, but education and outreach is half of what we do. And so it's my pleasure to meet with groups like the League of Women Voters to sort of give you all a primer on some of the campaign finance issues we're facing today, and a little bit about how potentially you can become active in sort of holding your own elected officials accountable. So let me just share my screen here and we can get started with this presentation.
Oh, good, it worked.
All righty. All right, so are you able to see the screen here, not the presenter view?
Yes.
All right, fantastic. So obviously we've already spoken a little bit about our organization. We are dedicated to following the money in Michigan politics. Our two programs are investigative reporting and then educational outreach. And I took over this position in November 2019, and we are in the early stages of rolling out a series of accountability tools that will make some of this information more accessible. The first one that is pretty close to being finished is a Twitter bot that will tweet out the name of any newly registered lobbyist in the state as the state uploads their information. So first I want to provide you all with a little bit of sort of trends that we're seeing in money in Michigan politics and what it has been the ongoing behavior as to how we're seeing money flow in the state level. And first of all, 2018 was the most expensive election year ever. This year may change that. We are already seeing an inundation of spending. And if you thought that the pandemic has sort of tampered down political activities, the opposite is very true. It is really prompted people to pour a lot more money into the forms of outreach that are the most cost intensive, including commercials and phone banking, every means of outreach that is really testing their pocketbooks. And increasingly, we're seeing that interest groups are taking matters into their own hands, going more directly to voters about their own priorities and hoping to put their fingers on the scale of a lot of these elections. And more of the money that is flowing into these elections from these interest groups are through methods that avoid disclosure and limits on spending through what we deem soft money and often dark money. And so it raises important questions about what this effect is on policy and what this effect is on tone. One example of that soft money group is from the 2018 election is a gubernatorial mailer that went out decrying Bill Schuette and Gretchen Whitmer as corporate puppets, saying that they rely on dark money campaigns that are untraceable and that you should vote for the Green Party candidate because she best represents your progressive interests. And this was funded by an organization called Michigan People for Progress. So luckily, Michigan People for Progress is not a nonprofit. It was a the political committee registered with the state. And so we were able to see through campaign finance records that all of their funding had come from another state level political committee called Michigan Prosperity. So if we go and we look up Michigan Prosperity, you'll see that all of their funding came from a committee called the Hardworking American Committee, another registered political committee. And that committee, all of their funding came from the Michigan Republican Party's administrative account. So clearly their intent was to target Democratic voters and push them towards Green Party candidates to draw down votes from Whitmer. But unfortunately, not all of these efforts are so readily traceable. In Muskegon County, Max Rixey, a libertarian, he's sort of someone who's perpetually running in each cycle. He spent about $3,500 running for the Michigan House in the most recent cycle. And he doesn't really ever have a chance of getting elected because he just doesn't have the financial resources. But he found that in this last election that he was getting mailers sent out promoting him, saying that the conservative incumbents were not really subscribing to the conservative principles that they should have, and that you should instead vote for this libertarian. Now, we didn't know who this was traced to because it was, I believe, leading to a nonprofit that does not disclose its donors. And so the trail there essentially runs dry, and we don't know who is attempting to move voters away from a Republican candidate. Another example of this is an organization that rose to prominence in the last cycle called Citizens for Energizing Michigan's Economy. Here's one of their ads.
Big government policies are hurting Michigan's economy. State Representative John Bison is pushing job-killing, high-cost policies in Lansing. Bison voted to keep fees high on Michiganders. Bison voted against the Republican plan to create good jobs in Michigan. And Bison source energy jobs to other states. Call your legislator. Tell them to oppose John Bison's job-killing policies.
Now, we would have never known who funded Citizens for Energizing Michigan's Economy, except for the fact that the Michigan Public Service Commission, the administrative body that that provides oversight of the state's utilities, requires our utilities to specifically disclose where they spend their civic and political activities cash. And it turns out that they had spent about $20 million towards this entity, Citizens for Energizing Michigan's Economy. And it spent about $900,000 sort of putting the finger on the scale of these primaries towards candidates for and against, depending upon their status and I guess favoritism towards Michigan's utilities. So this was just purely almost a fluke of luck that because Michigan has this accountability measure in place, other states don't have this or this disclosure requirement, that we were able to determine where that money came from. So as I said previously, 2018 was Michigan's most expensive election at the state level, even including congressional races. Now this election is easily poised to surpass that despite the pandemic. But obviously we'll have to wait and see how things shake out in the final 7 or so weeks until the election. But we are on track, essentially. Now, obviously that also means that state house races are growing in cost. You can see in 2002, they cost about $15 million. And by 2018, they had almost doubled to $27.6 million. And pretty close to half of that is made up by the 10 most expensive races. And so, you may ask, why is there getting so much more money involved in politics? Is it because, Americans are just more engaged in politics? Are they just more interested in what's going on? I wish that was solely the case, but that's not what the data from state level races is showing us. What we're seeing instead, if you look at this graph here, and I have to apologize because I'm in the process of converting our graphics from things that are, in-person presentation friendly to Zoom friendly, a little bit easier to read. But there's two halves here. One representing all the money that was spent in the 2000s, and the next, all the money that was spent in the 2010s. And so small donors contributing less than $200, they increased from about $90 million to about $200 million over that between decades. But large donors kicked up quite a bit. They essentially 50% increase or so to about $300 million total in the last decade. But really the biggest growth that we have seen is from PACs. And that means any number from special interest groups that disclose their donors to the dark money organizations that do not. And so, the effect of this essentially is that individual people, whether they are ultra wealthy or the little guy, are having less of an impact on the pocketbooks of candidates than they did in the past, in large part because a lot of these organizations are allowed to now contribute unlimited amounts to various financial vehicles to support the candidates that agree with their agendas. If you look at the contrast here, in 2006, there was just about $20 million spent on state Senate races. And by 2018, that number had increased by more than 50% to $34.5 million, with the 7th district being the most expensive at close to $3 million. And we're seeing a similar increase now with the state house, but in a different way that I will describe a little bit later. So even on the gubernatorial side, we're seeing enormous growth. Candidate spending between 2010 and 2018 saw almost a 10-fold increase, large part because of the highly active nature of our politics in recent years and the national attention that this gubernatorial race was afforded. A lot of outside spending happened in this race that wouldn't be reported on either of these bars because they're not, it is considered soft money and you're not really seeing it in the same way. On the Republican side, you have actually a decrease in candidate spending, but an increase of some of those soft money, other forms of soft money that you're seeing with reported independent expenditures and unreported issue ads. And we will clarify a little bit as to what those mean a little later in the presentation. Now, in the general election, beyond the primaries, you can see that Whitmer had an enormous amount of independent expenditures in her favor. And these are the sort of soft money that I was talking about, where they can spend an unlimited amount and aren't reliant on the limitations that candidates themselves have in terms of contributions. So let's go into how our campaign finance system is structured in the United States very briefly. Obviously, as you know, we have a federal system of government. And so at the, there is a federal system, architecture of campaign finance, and a state one, but there's actually 3 tiers for our campaign finance system. Obviously, congressional and presidential elections are governed by the Federal Campaign Finance Act and the Federal Election Commission. That said, the Federal Election Commission cannot rule on any potential violations of federal campaign finance law because they have spent the vast majority of the last 15 months without enough commissioners in the agency to form a quorum and hold meetings and make decisions on these violations. As a result, everyone who's making a federal campaign finance violation complaint is essentially, yelling in the wind. And these complaints cannot go anywhere until there is another committee appointed to the body. Traditionally, these commissioners are appointed in a bipartisan manner with one Democrat and one Republican nominated at the same time moving through the Senate. That's not what we've seen under the current administration. Now at the state level, we are governed by the Michigan Campaign Finance Act. The state, the Michigan Department of State, the Bureau of Elections, generally administers and receives campaign finance filings from the legislature, gubernatorial elections, and the judiciary all the way down to municipal courts. All those records are available and digitized online on the Department of State's website. Now, this is the 3rd tier that receives a lot less attention, and that's that local elections. And nearly all county and city level offices, while they're governed by the Michigan Campaign Finance Act, they submit their filings to county clerks. And county clerks are hardworking and underappreciated local officials. That said, they're also not attorneys. And they're tasked with essentially monitoring these filings, of which they receive many under limited resources, and have to, they can't enforce the law themselves. They don't have the legal authority and have to instead fill out complaint sheets and send them to the Department of State. And then the Department of State gets to decide whether or not they want to fine these campaigns or enforce what could potentially be a violation. These records are not digitized. They're not readily available online, except for in 13 counties, some of the largest counties in the state. The other 70 counties, you have to essentially call up the clerk and ask and hope that you get them. I'm excited to announce that I'm actually partnering with the MSU School of Journalism. We have a bunch of journalism students, actually just in the next week or two, calling all these clerks and trying to get some campaign finance records to see how accessible these are. No one has done this before, and it's really going to be interesting to see how available these records are. So there's a few different kinds of campaigns. I don't want to get too much in the legalese here, but the first one, not campaigns, excuse me, committees. And the first one is candidate campaign committees. And they're able to advertise in a really straightforward way, ask you to elect them and talk about themselves and approve their ads. Corporations can't give to them, but they can tell you how to vote.
I started a small business at my kitchen table as a single mom. I know what it takes to create jobs and balance a budget. I'm Kelly Rossman McKinney. In the state Senate, I'll work with both parties to create jobs in Michigan.
Ms. Rossman McKinney actually ended up losing her race. That was from the 2018 cycle. There's no state Senate election this time around. And I wanted to use a state house campaign ad, but I haven't really seen one yet for the general election appear on television. Still waiting on that. So anyway, you can look up their records at the Secretary of State. And if you have any questions at any point during this, feel free to speak up. So all of these records are viewable online through the Secretary of State. Readily accessible, but they don't really have to be consistent in how they're writing down their donors. So from a data perspective, it's kind of difficult to synthesize information from them, but you still can read through them really easily. Now at the state level, in a state like Wayne County, Sheriff Benny Napoleon came under fire for, in his filing, what was a lot of personal expenditures. You can, but only recently. This is from a campaign filing from, you can see 2016, and here he is spending $5,100 on Detroit Lions tickets on the top line there. And you can see he's spending campaign money on nice restaurants and various, $410 at the Fox Theater. And all of this information has been right there for more than 4 years, but essentially no one had looked closely at these filings. And when asked, the county clerk said that the Campaign Finance Act was too vague for them to enforce any potential violations. This stuff is really easy to find. As just a little experiment for myself, I looked through a few campaign filings this morning. I found the Genesee County Treasurer, Deb Cherry. Here's a filing from her from 2013. And here she is spending more than $4,000 of her campaign money to travel to Washington, D.C. for President Obama's second term inauguration and stayed at a really nice hotel there, $4,000. And this was never covered in the news. No one found out about this stuff, largely because local news doesn't have the resources to track these things really closely. And what I have to assume is that the clerks do not either. So those are our state and local levels. Now, if you want to track candidate spending at the federal level, you can do that online at fec.gov. They have a searchable database. It's very easy to do so. That said, the way that candidates at the federal level fundraise is quite a bit more complex than the way they do at the state and local levels. Often they'll have many committees associated with their campaign, and so you kind of have to look through all of those if you really want to get some transparency out of what they're doing. Another way is you can use third-party websites, such as opensecrets.org, which kind of breaks down and analyzes some of the federal candidates' contributions and expenditures for you, as well as dark money organizations. And then even at our own website at mcfn.org, we have a follow the money database that just discloses the top 10 donors for each candidate. And that's in the process of being updated. Unfortunately, because of the issues with state level campaign finance, I have to update that by hand. And so it's a time consuming process and something I'm in the process of now. So beyond candidate spending, what we're seeing as increasingly the dominant force of spending in our elections beyond candidate spending is independent spending. And so here is an ad for Tom Barrett from an independent expenditure committee.
Tom Barrett, a proven leader running for Michigan Senate. Barrett led the fight to lower auto insurance costs by 40%, eliminate fraud, and save Michigan families from the highest auto insurance premiums in the nation. Barrett is eliminating wasteful spending, ensuring tax dollars go to fixing roads, improving schools, and training workers for the jobs of tomorrow. Tom Barrett, endorsed by the Michigan Chamber of Commerce because he will protect taxpayers and strengthen our economy. Tom Barrett, for states.
So while some independent expenditure committees can tell you how to vote, this particular kind cannot. And that's because it is a form of soft money, which is different from hard money. Hard money in our election system is what is considered PACs and candidate committees, essentially telling you, this is our candidate, this is why they're great, please vote for them. Their money's traceable, we know where it's coming from. That is if the sources themselves disclose their donors, which generally, you can generally see that, but not always. Where soft money is the idea of outside spending, an interest group or a political PAC running what we call issue advocacy ads, meaning that they cannot tell you explicitly that you should vote for this candidate. Instead, they say, Gary Peters has done a great job of lowering prescription drug prices. You should call his office and thank him. Or on the opposite, you could say Gary Peters is not, is keeping our prescription drug prices high to enrich himself. Call his office and complain. You're not essentially, I guess, it's telling people how to vote, but you are in effect saying this person is good or bad, and it gets pretty close to that point. So dark money, then, is a form of this soft money. And it's really any organization taking part in the electoral process that is obscuring the source of this funding. They bring undisclosed money into the political system, generally as nonprofits under the IRS 501c tax code. They don't have to report their donors, and the IRS actually obscures them on their 990 disclosures. Another very common way is through super PACs, which super PACs themselves are not actually opaque organizations. They have to report who's donating to them, but they can receive unlimited corporate contributions. And what that means is that someone can easily set up a shell company where you don't know any of the money is coming from in that shell company, and that can make an enormous expenditure into that super PAC. Another way, a third way, and this is kind of wishy-washy as to whether this qualifies as dark money, but it is avoiding disclosure, is the idea of a pop-up super PAC, which means that maybe it's being funded by an organization that does have to disclose its donors, but it is created 2 weeks before the election, spends $10 million or whatever on advertisements, and then all those run, they might affect the election, and we don't know where any of that money comes from because they haven't had to report yet, and they won't have to report until a good while after the election. So here's an example of one of these issue ads.
Lobbyist Kelly Rossman McKinney says whatever it takes to get what she wants. When the state began work on the new state police headquarters, she said, quit spending money we don't have. But when a politically connected developer hired her, she said, the state is getting a great deal in all kinds of ways. A cozy, no-bid contract, a building the state police didn't want, a $46 million bad deal for taxpayers. Kelly Rossman McKinney, once a lobbyist, always a lobbyist.
And so that's paid for by, you can see, a Public Voice Inc. We don't know where their funding comes from. We don't really know much about the entity other than perhaps who registered it and who the front people are for it. Frequently, some of these organizations, when they register either as a nonprofit or an LLC, will use an attorney that is sort of the front person for these organizations, representing all the money that's behind it. Funnily enough, one of the largest law firms that does this in Lansing is Dykema Gossett, which shares a lobby with the Michigan State Senate. They are in the same building. and they use different elevators, but they walk past each other every single day. So here's an example of a mailer of a dark money group paid for by some organization called Michigan for Traditional Values, some company saying that you should call Tom Barrett and tell him it's time to drain the swamp and put our community first. Pretty creative ad, honestly. A little bit more interesting than what you normally see, but again, we don't know how this was funded or what their actual agenda is, other than to be against Tom Barrett. So moving on from this, some of the top donors in Michigan. This is accurate as of mid-2019. The DeVos family is obviously sort of the preeminent political family in the state. They spent over $11 million. Sri Tanadar, as a candidate, has bankrolled his own candidacies. He's not really distributing this money wildly. And then most of these largest names are really big benefactors of GOP sources. Interestingly enough, while Republican caucus PACs and political party PACs have received a lot of this ultra wealthy money, we know where this is coming from because it's the family. And whereas Democrats have in recent years benefited a little bit more from some of these dark money organizations, because Democrats in Michigan simply don't have this foundation of ultra wealthy patrons who are going to sort of fund their war chests. One other thing I should mention is that while we say the DeVos family, that's because for an entity like a caucus PAC, which is one of the many types of committees, there's one for each chamber of the legislature and each party. The individual contribution amount is $41,975 per year. And so the way that you can get around this is that you just have all of your family members hit the contribution limit. And then as a result, you can give an enormous amount of money. So what we're seeing as a result of this is increased dark money is that the negative ads are primarily what they spies really kind of go for. This is a contrast in the 2020 election, whereas Trump's campaign and Biden's campaign have really, well, not so much Biden's campaign, but primarily Trump's campaign has had no qualms about going on the attack against Biden. Especially, I'm sure some of you watching Much TV have heard the phrase, "You won't be safe in Joe Biden's America." Whereas Biden has had support of a large constellation of dark money organizations. While his campaign is outspending Trump's, he's able to stay largely positive while these dark money organizations essentially go on the attack for him. Now, so at the state level, as a result, Michigan has the lowest rank in state integrity in terms of transparency for financial disclosures. We don't have any. And while we have the Freedom of Information Act in this state, and you can FOIA state agencies to try to find out what's going on behind the scenes, you want to find out about what's going on in the legislature or the governor's office, you can't. It's wholly exempt from the Freedom of Information Act. You literally cannot ask them for records. And so as a result of this no personal financial disclosures, then you can, in turn, vote on bills in which you have a conflict of interest. Because I don't know if you can't talk about your personal financial potential conflicts of interest, then all they could really run on is the honor system, essentially. So from there, what we're seeing is an increase of centralized money. Actually, we'll skip this slide. That is a different branch we don't need to go down right now. But a lot of this stems from, obviously, the Supreme Court ruling that many of you are probably familiar with, which found that essentially limiting independent spending by corporations and labor organizations is unconstitutional. And Anthony Kennedy, former justice now, believed that the internet and broad disclosures would allow people to see who's behind all of this free speech. And he said this transparency enables the electorate to make informed decisions that give proper weight to different speakers and messages. But I don't think that the majority of the electorate is reading the fine print at the bottom of these ads. And as we'll see a little later in the presentation, they are extremely similar. It is often very difficult to tell a dark money group's ad apart from a candidate's own. So a little bit more, he says, with the advent of the internet, prompt disclosure of expenditures can provide shareholders and citizens with the information needed to hold corporations and elected officials accountable for their positions and supporters. As we can see over the last 10 years, it simply hasn't happened. So as a short update as to where we are now in the 2020 election, we are smashing all records compared to the previous election. There's already been spent, just since March, since the end of the presidential primary, $76 million on television, radio, and cable ad spending. And this will likely surpass $150 million by the election day. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that Michigan is a battleground state in this election. You know, a lot of analysts and prognosticators are saying that this state has a lot of importance, and it's being reflected in the amount of cash that's being dumped into this state. If you look at the contrast between that 2016, when Democrats thought they could rely on the solid blue presidential history of the state, they spent about $8 million from April 2015 through Election Day. And by now, by contrast, the campaigns have spent $36 million since March. This is not even including the constellation of dark money groups that is supporting each candidate, particularly on the Democrat side. Priorities USA Action and other organizations are inundating the airwaves. And it's going to be interesting to see in the next 7 weeks how much further this torrent increases. But it's likely to be a banner year. And a large part of this is due to the fact that Democrats have decided not to knock doors, which is, you know, sort of the bread and butter of all campaigning, and because of the coronavirus pandemic. And so they have a lot of field organizing money that is being redirected into these other methods of outreach. So in the Senate race, the US Senate race between Gary Peters and John James, there's already more than $30 million spent on TV advertising. Gary Peters has had 9 dark money groups backing him so far, and through broadcast advertising, while John James has had 5. And it's worth pointing out that in all of these federal races, dark money and issue advocacy groups have, in total, have outspent candidate campaigns. So there is an interesting way in which this has changed the campaign playbook, in that campaigns now posture themselves to try to show like they have a fighting chance, not to the electorate, but rather to deep-pocketed dark money organizations, so that those organizations will then make another investment in their campaign and, you know, have a $3 or $5 million ad buy to show that they really still have a fighting chance. But these organizations view these purchases as investments, and if they see polls widen, they have no qualms pulling those ad reservations and getting their money back, because they don't think that it's a worthwhile expenditure. So at the state level, in the legislature, when you are running as a challenger, you're generally reliant on you know, your friends, neighbors, connections, maybe interest groups that you can get endorsements out of to run your elections. When you're an incumbent, you don't have to campaign quite as hard because there is a strong place-based fundraising culture in Lansing. A lot of organizations like Public Affairs Associates hold a fundraiser for you. A lot of different lobbyists come in, they pay maybe $200 to $500 a ticket, and you can get a substantial bolstering of your campaign coffers from these, you know, single day events. And then you can spend a lot more time potentially legislating, maybe meeting constituents. But anyway, you don't have to fundraise as hard because you have this war chest built up. And this really has been evidenced by the coronavirus pandemic, how this sort of glad handing and face-to-face conversation with PACs and special interests matters. You can see from here, in 2016, from December through June, how there was essentially a steady incline of PAC contributions in the yellow here. And then individuals, either large donors and small donors, have remained relatively consistent. Now, during the 2020, at the inception of the stay-at-home order, that all changed. PAC fundraising essentially flatlined when it should be continuing to increase. And that's because these events and these fundraisers were canceled. Lobbyists could not take representatives out to lunch. We have right now, based upon the most recent disclosures, the second lowest food and beverage spending from lobbyists on record, at least with the only one lower being in 2001. They spent between January 1 and August 31st, $221,000 on food and beverage for elected officials, whether that be representatives, senators, department heads, or certain staff members in the governor's office. And to give you an extent of the lobbying culture in Lansing, the fact that $221,000 in 8 months is a low number to spend on food for lobbying is a little bit astounding. The previous year, it was close to $600,000. So we've talked a lot about dark money spending on traditional broadcast mediums, TV and radio and cable, but really the new frontier for this, and it really in large part, responsible for the success of our current president in 2016 is the new advertising frontier of social media. And you can easily fall down the rabbit hole of this sort of advertising because it is harder to find out who is backing it, what they want, and what they're doing. Private companies, Facebook and Google, don't have to disclose who's advertising on their platform and how much they're spending. The ads can be targeted to someone's demographics, their personal interests, their beliefs, psychological inclinations. They're targeted to specific area codes, which is a lot more specific than a TV market in the Metro Detroit area. Michigan politicos and political consultants are just starting to harness this technology. And what we're seeing is it's not so much used on the state level or for legislative races, but at the hyper-local level for things like Delta Township Supervisor over here in the Lansing area. We saw a dark money group get involved in that race of all things, disparaging the opponent who is the incumbent, running against a legislative aide who is the challenger. So here's an example of the sort of roundabout ways you can be politically advertised. This group, United Research Group, these are an example of 3 ads from them. It's saying that they're giving away money for just answering a survey. How would you rate Trump? And you can see that they send out a bunch of different iterations of this. You can see multiple versions of the same ad. And the reason why they're doing this is a little bit to give you some negative information about Trump, but primarily they're looking to harvest your data. They want to find out where your inclinations are, how you feel about certain things, and then they can tie that specifically to your Facebook account. And this is actually run, although it says United Research Group, that's a company that's linked to Acronym, which is one of the largest liberal dark money organizations working in this election. They also have started a pseudo news arm called Courier, and that was that was one of the largest advertisers leading up to the August primary. They release stories labeled as news, but they essentially are a convincing form of, I guess, press releases for their candidates of choice. I can go more into this, but I think in the interest of time and leaving time for some questions, I think I'll just end it here and maybe skip a little bit ahead to this, which is where we're at in 2020 as of the end of June in terms of state legislative fundraising. This is a bar chart that's showing the top 2 bars are the caucus PACs. And these are, you can give to these, and they represent the entire caucus for the House and the Republicans in the state legislature. And you can see that there's a big disparity in funding. Republicans have raised a lot more than Democrats. Though Democrat candidates, you can see in the next 2 bars, have outraised Republicans. But that's more or less irrelevant because what these caucus PACs can do is give unlimited amounts well, they have one, much higher contribution limits on an individual basis than candidate committees do, and they can give unlimited amounts to candidate committees in general elections. So if a election in a swing district is coming down to the wire, they can easily pour in $200,000 or $300,000 in the final weeks for an advertising blitz that puts their candidate over the line. And you can see that they're largely funded by PAC organizations on both sides of the aisle because they're caucus PACs, they're creatures of Lansing, and that's where they do their fundraising. You can see that also Democrats get quite a bit more small donors on a candidate level basis than Republicans do, but they also have a larger PAC fundraising. But they both have pretty considerable amounts of self-funding, which has become a larger trend, though not particularly significant in the recent years. Now, leadership PACs on the final two bars are also particularly important because these are hosted by basically members of the House with significant influence in their caucus, the largest of which is run by the Speaker of the House, Lee Chatfield, a Republican. And he has not one leadership PAC, but 4. And crucially, these can accept from individuals 10 times the amount individuals could give to a candidate committee. So they allow an individual to essentially have 10 times the power through these leadership PACs, and then the influential caucus leaders can then distribute the money as they like to various different campaigns. And because Lee Chatfield has 4 of these, he can exceed even that 10 times limit 4 times because his wealthy benefactors can essentially just give to each one at the limit. And so I want to leave you all with a difficult question, and that's, a lot of people say if you amend the Constitution and Citizens United, then it will stop, the unlimited corporate money and bring transparency to our politics. But I'm skeptical of this because when you look at the ways that money is moving through our political system now, a wealthy donor can give to his foundation, and then a foundation can give to a nonprofit that's running issue ads. And so because that nonprofit doesn't have to disclose its donors, you don't know where that money's coming from. And so if they required transparency all the way up the line, they required nonprofits to disclose their donors and everything else, you would be surprised how many hoops they're willing to go through. So while this is the current flow of cash, what if it looks something more like this? And we've seen from our global financial system that ultra wealthy individuals have no qualms about doing this if it suits their ends. And so I think that I want to leave you with just the thought that there are no easy solutions or quick fixes to this problem. And I would encourage us to have productive conversations coming together on a nonpartisan basis so that we can look at ways to move our democracy forward to a way that is more representative and allows individuals to have a dominant voice rather than faceless entities. Thank you so much.
Very interesting.
Very
Thanks, Simon.
discouraging.
Discouraging is the word. Joan, you have a question? You want to unmute yourself? Or is that a clap? I think it's a clap.
That's a clap.
I have some questions, but I'm willing to cede some time to other people if you have any. If you want to raise your hand. Donna, go ahead.
Have there been studies in other similar industrialized countries on how they limit campaign contributions, not only the time that you get to campaign, but do they also limit and provide any better system for transparency that you're aware of?
Sorry. So some countries in Europe do have periods in which campaigning is legal where you can only campaign within like 6 weeks leading up to the election. And so that sort of limits, I know that this campaign season feels like it's gone on for 10 years. And so it limits, that sort of effect. And then another pilot program that I would say is particularly promising has been started in Seattle, where they have like a fund, and this is, this would probably only work for wealthy cities, but essentially they give every resident a credit of $300. They don't actually have the cash, but it's like a credit. And then they can take that money and distribute it to candidates as they see fit. And then they can give it to the candidates that they prefer or distribute it to multiple candidates. And then as a result, it kind of levels the playing field for some of these challengers going up against particularly wealthy incumbents.
Oh, thank you.
I'll throw out a question. The phone surveys that we all get right off the bat sound like they're kind of innocent, but eventually there's such leading questions. That the sponsor of the survey is someone who is supporting or opposing a candidate. Are those considered campaign donations, or are those just so hard to follow that nobody pays any attention to them?
So those would fall under soft money under a lot of instances. Those are referred to as push polls. And yeah, the intent is to obviously sway you, but like seem unbiased at the beginning. And those would fall under soft money because they're not expressly saying, please vote for whomever, and so as a result, they're able to avoid having to disclose anything.
Okay. Anybody else? Angela, unmute yourself if you could.
I just did. Simon, do you see this expense getting better or worse after we have the Independent Redistricting Commission? Theoretically, those districts are supposed to be more fair, but it would almost seem to me that that'll really up the ante for these soft money, dark money people to come out of the woodwork.
That's a really good question. And what I would anticipate is that overall spending is going to increase. But that's not necessarily a bad thing on its face because it's going to mean that more districts are more competitive. I don't know if you remember that previous slide where I showed that the top 10 House races were almost half of the total cost of running an election. So what you're going to see, I would anticipate, is that number goes down, although overall spending will increase. And it's also going to require caucus committees to distribute their funding probably more widely. That is, if the Independent Redistricting Commission does its job well, and we have lots of competitive districts. I know me personally, as a political journalist, I'm really interested to see how that's going to play out.
Mm-hmm.
I have another question. You had mentioned early in the presentation, you were talking about looking at Benny Napoleon's campaign financing statement, I think from 2013, and he had spent money on Lions tickets, and this was never challenged. So my question is this would have been, I presume, the responsibility of the county clerk to challenge this? And are the rules just so nondescript that it's not worth anyone looking at that?
So this is one of the difficulties of our system and the way that it's set up. Because they file at the county level, that the county clerks don't have the ability to legally enforce the law. They can't mete out punishments. They can't say, Benny, you have to pay a $5,000 fine. What they do then is essentially write, if they want to have this enforced by the Department of State, they have to write out a complaint, to the department and say, this is what's happened, this is what's alleged, and but they have to take the time and the resources to do that as well. And part of the difficulty is that these county clerks, like I said, they're not election attorneys, and they're elected officials themselves, and the things that their constituents are relying on them for, keeping the court in order, administering elections. As a result, campaign finance generally falls quite a bit below that, especially in more rural counties, where these records are particularly important. And I hope that answers your question. So I say part of the difficulty for them to interpret and sort of police this is that the act itself is not particularly specific to a lot of things. The Department of State has the authority to like issue interpretive rulings that make decisions. Like, for example, the act does not definitively state whether you can use campaign funds on personal expenses or not. It was only after a later on ruling from the Department of State that said explicitly you can't do this, that was actually determined. So they would have to not only know the law, but also know this library of interpretive rulings to be able to really have a good grasp on this particularly complex piece of legislation.
Donna?
What happens to campaign war chests if the person is not elected or they retire? Where does that money go?
So there's a number of different things. A lot of people opt to donate their campaign war chest to charity, but you can't pocket it, certainly not. But there's a number of different options.
So we don't really know unless they announce what they're going to do with their war chest.
No, they would generally file an article of dissolution, and then, I mean, they essentially have to stop reporting to the state. I could pull out my legal guide for you and tell you specifically what they're able to do, but I don't have it at hand at the moment.
Again, I always find it interesting, people that run that have no chance of winning whatever, but they amass these war chests and just always wonder what happens to the money.
Yeah, if you chat your email, I can give you more specifics shortly after the presentation.
Thank you.
Those war chests can be carried over to a future campaign, right?
That's correct.
Yes.
Oh, that I understand. Yep.
Angela, did you have a question?
I do. I have a different question. On our federal and our state tax returns, we've got that little box that we could check saying that we want money to go to election funds. And it's certainly not talked about very much. I use TurboTax, and it's almost impossible to even find where the question is to check that box on my federal return. But the fact is, some of us do give that money, and what happens to it?
That's a really good question. Most of my, I'll tell you what the extent of what I know. Most of our work is concentrated at the state level, of course, so I don't have like an encyclopedic knowledge of federal regulations. But I can tell you that presidential campaigns, if they choose to accept public funding, then are constricted in terms of their contribution limits and the kinds of funding from different organizations they can accept. And I know that over the last few cycles, presidential campaigns have opted not to receive that money because I believe it caps them at a certain level of contributions. So my understanding is that it's probably sitting in that account waiting if someone deems worthy to take advantage of it.
I think it's on the state tax return as well.
Yes, that one. Yeah, so that is taken by some gubernatorial campaigns, but not in all instances. Again, if you send me your email, I can give you I can send you some specifics.
But even if they take that money, you've still got all these outside groups that can be doing their pro and con things, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I should say that unfortunately, these outside spending groups, while they often semi-coordinate with campaigns, sometimes they can, they have no choice as to whether or not these people are, attacking or defending them or supporting them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's been my understanding, which has got to be difficult if you're a candidate and you don't want that kind of dirty campaigning, so to speak, but some other group goes out and does it in your name. It still attaches to you even if you don't know about it.
Yes, one candidate who's actually had to, and some reporting I'd recently worked on, who's had to defend herself or disavow herself from the spending is Alyssa Slotkin, because she had vowed not to, allow this kind of, or not to support this kind of spending in her race, but it happens whether she wants it to or not.
Okay, Barb, I think you had a question, but you need to unmute yourself. Go ahead.
Okay, you can hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I attempted to do some research on Joe Bellino's money, his contributions, and how he ends up spending it, and or how much he's taking in. And I found very, very little information. Does that mean that, I mean, I know that he's got to report it, but what's that an indication of, do you think?
And he's running for state rep, right, Barb?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And he's not termed out, right? He's running this cycle. There should be quite a bit of money being raised in that race. Are you going through the searchable database in the campaign finance disclosure at the Department of State?
No, I think I went to Open Secrets.
Open Secrets does not have much information.
Okay.
For this sort of information at the state level specifically, and if they do, probably not well updated. So here I will post in the link a link to his campaign committee directly. I can pull this up pretty quickly here.
Okay. Also, I would like to, I didn't quite understand what you said when you were talking about someone being forced to vote in a certain way. Can you explain that more? I think you were talking about PAC money.
I'm not certain I know what you're referring to, but I might have been talking about how candidates have outside spending groups, you know, either supporting them or attacking them without their consent. Because what these groups will do is, you know, they'll have an agenda of their own in a lot of circumstances, but in others, when they're not allowed to, when they're technically not allowed to coordinate, candidates will do things like make a bunch of stock footage of themselves available on a YouTube page. And so then a outside spending group can, you know, use all that stock footage to make it look a lot like it's a candidate advertisement, even when it's not.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else? I can't say that this was a very encouraging talk, but other talks that we've had, I remember feeling the same way, that it is, especially when you see that Michigan is the worst really in the country in terms of transparency. After redistricting is in place and perhaps we get a more competitive legislature, we can hopefully hope that some of those laws will be reversed so that there is more transparency in campaign financing.
Yeah, and I mean, if there's one encouraging note that I could add is that while social media and, you know, our digital age has opened up a whole new level of ways dark money can, you know, advertise to us, it's also opened up a whole new way that we can support candidates. You'll see that a lot of candidates are supported by, you know, an army of $3 contributions, which is making, you know, it's opening up the door for a ton of people to become politically involved in the sense that they can support their candidates in a way that they weren't able to before.
Right. Well, thank you, Simon, for joining us. We really appreciated the education, and we're just about at our 1 hour mark. So thank you all. We didn't really have much of a lunch on this meeting, but you certainly were welcome to do that if you wanted to. And we'll do this again sometime. And thanks everybody for joining us. And this recording will be available. We'll be getting it out to all of our members at a later date. Thanks, Simon.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Meeting you. Bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.